People have all sorts of assumptions about this letter called the Revelation. One of those assumptions is that this ancient letter, written in the first century, is a prediction about the future. As I've worked my way through this letter, it seems to me an awful lot of this letter has actually been about here and now, or in fact about there and then, when John's first listeners were living in the first century. Or not just about then and there, but every stage of human history. Instead of a prediction about the future, it seemed more like a crazy, multi-angled diagnosis. A diagnosis of what's really happening. About what is behind being locked down. What's behind being put under the pressure of the latest fake empire that tries to grind you down or distract you or take you in a different direction or get you to buy into what they're doing. So that you, as a follower of this crazy, dead and resurrected Jewish teacher of Jesus of Nazareth, are crying out. And so this letter, tucked away at the back of this collection of books we call the Bible, has not been so much about the future all the way through it until now. Until chapter 21. And here we finally get a vision about the future, and there what's revealed to the writer, the man who's having these experiences, we call him John, is described as a new heaven and a new earth. I don't know what your idea of heaven is. I know that for a long time, my idea of heaven was based on an idea sold to me that heaven is a place far away, probably in the sky. And it's a place people go when they die, if they're lucky. The main idea being that everyone who makes it, who behaves, who gets in, would most likely then probably become some sort of spirits and live in some sort of paradise, bliss of some sort, and clouds might be involved. There were two problems with these ideas. The first problem was that these ideas about heaven are not actually found anywhere in this set of books we call the Bible, the Jewish scriptures and the stories of the movement of Jesus of Nazareth. I'm not sure where exactly they came from, lots of places actually, but they aren't from in here. That's only the first problem. The second problem is that these kinds of ideas of heaven, despite what everyone said to me about them being great and about how I should really behave so that I could go there one day, the problem is that inside me then and actually now, still, I feel it in my bones, it doesn't sound appealing at all. It sounds dull. I like things. I like stuff. I like having a body. I like living and breathing. I like football. I like eating. I like hugging. I like snowboarding. I like playing music. I like reading. I like working. I like writing. I like finding things out. I like exploring. Being or becoming some sort of know-it-all spirit in the sky doesn't sound appealing. If that's what I'm waiting for, if that's all I'm waiting for, then maybe count me out. What a surprise then, that John's vision, which is of the future here at the end, is nothing like that. When John talks about a new heaven and a new earth, you might immediately get a couple of concepts in your head that he's talking about two different things. But in fact, all the way through these stories, all the way through the Jewish understanding, the phrase heaven and earth didn't mean two different things. It was a phrase that just meant everything. everything you can see and touch, and that might be the earth part, I guess, and everything that you can't see and touch, heaven, and both of them together. You see, when these stories, when Jewish stories talk about heaven, it isn't about something far away. Instead, heaven is about how and where and in what sense God is at work. Whether we can actually sense that or not. So heaven is not separate. Heaven is the reality of God at work. Heaven presses in on our reality. It's part of everything. It's part of the wholeness. So far from describing his experience of a vision of when the well-behaved will all escape from this earth and travel to a spiritual retreat centre, the vision John's given is of a new heaven and a new earth. And the words new in that phrase don't mean, the language that's being used there, don't mean a replacement. Not a get rid of the old and buy a new. Instead, the sense is more of a refresh, a renewal, a restoration, a resurrection, a recreation. Something being made to be what it was made to be. This God is not somebody who throws it in the bin. This God is a repairer, a restorer, a renewer, a recycler. In fact, all the way through, that's what he tells his people. They were made to be partners in that renewing, restoring, resurrecting project. That's why we're so fascinated by TV programs and stories and the actual act of creating and refreshing and renewing and discovering and mending and healing and dealing with things that seem to have gone the wrong way or got broken, need fixed or mended or healed. There's no suggestion here that the creation is half-baked and needs to go in the bin. The real surprise in these sets of visions at the end is that none of this should come as a surprise. Because on the very first page of this collection, in a set of poems called Genesis, this God created a heavens and earth, everything, and declared it good. Not temporary, not shoddy, not half-baked, but good. Look at John's vision here again. The next surprise in the picture is that a city comes down from heaven, so from God's reality. And the city is Jerusalem. Jerusalem was, of course, the capital city of the Jews of Israel, the home of the temple. The word became a catchphrase for the temple, but more than that, a shorthand phrase for God's people themselves. Can you remember the good old days? Can you remember when everything was fine? The truth is that those days didn't exist. So many of us want to live in the past, to go back to the past. Imagine some sort of golden age in the past that if we could just get everyone back to, everything would be fine again. It's no accident that this story began with a set of poems set in a garden. And then the reality of these stories, it's not a fantasy story, is that something went wrong. So there's a diagnosis in here of why the world is not as it's supposed to be. But this set of stories doesn't then see the way forward as going back, as getting back to some golden age. It's no accident that this story is about movement, and this story ends with the vision, not of a garden, but of a city. This is not a story about going to some basic age in the past. This is a story that's been going somewhere, a movement, a development, a project. God's always been at work, helping creation to reach its potential, and the symbol of reaching that potential in this, one of the symbols, is a city. Not just any city, not the fake empire cities in this letter that have been used as symbols of corruption, of evil, of everything that works against God's creation project, the kind of thing that God's got to get rid of at the end. And the symbols in there have been of Babylon and Rome. These cities have all been imitations, fakes. This story says you can't beat the real thing, and you can't imagine what the real thing is going to be like. When God restores his creation to be the way it was made to be and it reaches its potential, all these fakes will pale into insignificance and they will be removed because they're not part of it. Look again. Read again. John, as we know by now, mashes his metaphors together, and this city is then described as a bride. Another image that John's been playing with through his letter, building on his Jewish story, that the image, the reality is that God is in a relationship with his creation. John couldn't make it any clearer as he just goes on and he layers it up and says in 3 or 4 different ways, look, at the end, when God puts everything to rights, God's place is now among his people. We're not going somewhere else, he's coming here. And this is not a surprise to us as we've been reading this letter. This letter's been jammed full of images of a living Jesus standing in the middle of his people. John's listeners, with their Jewish roots, would have felt their hearts move at reading or hearing read out loud the word for dwell in this part, because in its Greek and even in its Hebrew roots, the word is the word for tent, for tabernacle. God pitches his tent is the sense of dwelling here. The tabernacle was how God met with his people as they travelled in the desert in their Exodus stories. It's the same root as the word Shekinah, which is all the way through these stories as the image of God's presence with them, often in their worship, in their connections, in their sacrifice as they respond to him. This is the kind of God who is revealed, not a God far away waiting to hand out prizes for good behaviour, but a God who is with us, a God who made his creation for our relationship, and he won't let anything get in the way of being with us. This God, John says, beautifully is a tear wiper. This God will wipe every tear from his children's eyes personally. As I've said, the surprise is that none of this should be a surprise. This set of books we call the Bible is, as I've argued, hundreds of stories, but at the same time it's one big story, and part of that big story is a promise story. A story of a God who makes and who keeps his promises. And these promises are there at the beginning in Genesis. They're there in the journeys of Exodus. They're there as God connects with his people through a book called Leviticus. They're there in their song books in the Psalms. And they're there in the words of so many of the inspired prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel and so many more. Story after story about the God who hears the cry, who responds and who promises that he will, in fact he is working to put things to rights. That he will, as John describes here, recreate a new heaven and earth. He will get rid of things like weeping and crying. That his creation project will reach its potential. Nothing gets in the way. This God has been saying and doing on every day of history the same thing. It's a thing that I actually can feel in my bones as I hear it. John repeats, God says, I am making all things new. This is why John writes. This is the God who's faithful and true. He doesn't say, I'm waiting to get rid of everything so I can have life with you guys as a bunch of spirits in the sky. No, he says, I'm making all things new. This is not a vision about an escape. In this vision, no one escapes. Instead, there's an invasion. Our God, as he was always planning for, always working towards, comes here to be with his people. Now that feels like something worth enduring for, something worth waiting for.